Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast and get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today, we welcome Koshin Paley Ellison. He's a Zen teacher and psychotherapist. He's the author of the book Untangled, Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion. There's an excerpt from that book on Kevin MD titled Embracing Vulnerability, a Doctor's Journey of Healing and Connection. Koshin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start by briefly sharing your story and journey.
Yeah. So when I was 8 years old, I told my mother I wanted to grow up to be a Zen Buddhist monk. And the short story is I did. And along the way, I had the pleasure and privilege of caring for my grandmother, who was an incredible immigrant from Hungary. And she was the one who, seeing how many clinicians were so well-meaning, as she said, so many of them are so well-meaning. The doctors, the nurses, all these clinicians are so well-meaning, but they somehow forget what is most important, which is to actually just be where they are. They're so distracted, so anxious, and who's caring for them? And she said, you and Chodo should start a center where you teach people about Zen and how to care. And so now, 18 years later, we have done that, and we created the New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care, which is really the true founder of it is a woman named Rachel Schwartz, who was my grandma. Yeah.
So tell us today how clinicians can use that concept and philosophy of contemplative medicine. How can that help them today?
For me, it's really about learning how to slow down and really listen, which is the contemplation piece of it, is really how do you really take a moment to pause? And many of us say, oh, we don't have any time. And we know the average clinician visit can be 3 minutes, but there's a lot that can be done in 3 minutes. And learning how to be right where you are and nowhere else, and what that feels like, both inside of yourself and for others. And the other piece of it is that the word medicine itself has often become so different from what it originally meant, and which is what is healing, what is helpful, what is nourishing. And so those two words together, like how do we stop and realize what is the actual nourishment that we need? And the other word that's very important to us in terms of our contemplative medicine fellowship is the word fellowship, which is often, I've met so many clinicians who have done fellowships and they have never really felt a sense of fellowship. There's still a deep sense of loneliness and detachment from others. And so how do we learn how to have loving, caring relationships with other clinicians and with the people in our life? Yeah.
So I'm sure you talk to so many physicians, so many clinicians where they are distracted, where there are so many obstacles that prevent them from slowing down and developing those relationships. So tell me some stories that you see, and what are some specific examples of how some of your teachings have helped these clinicians who come to your center?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the one I wrote about in that piece from Untangled is a physician attending physician, mid-career. And she came to this fellowship to really understand how to do things differently. And there was this listening to this discontent and the burnout. And burnout is actually can be very helpful if we can actually realize, oh, I need to do something differently. I can't function in the same way. So she did that, which was to me so amazing. So as she self-described crawling into this training, and realizing that she had never really looked one of her patients in the eye for many, many, many years. because when she was in her fellowship, in her specialty, she was not taught how to have difficult conversations. And so the first conversation she had to have was very painful and giving someone really challenging news. And since that time, she had not looked someone in the eye. So this is just an example, right? And what she realized is that over time, it was wearing her down. She felt depersonalized in her work. She felt that she didn't know how to just like look at someone, and she didn't really know how to look at herself. And so that these behaviors, all of our habits need to be cared for. And so over time, what she learned how to do was to realize, well, maybe it's not such a big idea to be uncomfortable. That many times during the day, I'm going to have to share uncomfortable news. And how do I find the support that I need so that I can be in the discomfort in a new way? And it was amazing to see what happened to her in terms of her sense of joy and her sense of that vulnerability of just looking at someone and sharing what's difficult actually became what was nourishing to her, that she felt more connected to at work. And actually, what over time happened was also her relationship with her partner.
Hmm.
They began to look more carefully at each other with more care and attention. And she began to build friendships again that were more, again, having that sense of connectedness, which we often are longing for. As we know, about over 35% of people in just at least the United States report not even having a single friend. And that is even people in marriages. So we're in that world, and we know that social connection is everything for health.
Short of taking a contemplative medicine fellowship, what are some things they can do short of taking that fellowship to incorporate some of those teachings into their daily lives? Because the situation to describe in terms of those obstacles and burnout, it's so prevalent today. So what are some, I guess, low hanging fruit? What are some things that they can do to incorporate more contemplation into their professional and personal lives?
Yeah, there are many things that we can do. Well, one of them is learning how to pause. It's so interesting, that is just something that we talk about on the first day of the fellowship is pausing. And it is often the one thing that is most significant. But the thing is that really learning how to practice pausing, like, oh, how have I paused this morning,
Mm.
to ask ourselves that question. And many of us don't pause because we feel so uncomfortable and we don't want to feel that feeling. So how do you practice even like a little micro pause, just for a moment, coming back? And often encourage people to put their hands on their lower belly, just below their belly button, and just feel your breath there and pause and take 3 breaths. Everyone has time to do that. And the other thing I often encourage people to do is see if you can find something new between when you leave your house, if you leave your house, and when you get to the next place. Can you notice something new that is beautiful?
Mhm.
Very simple. And actually, some of the folks I know, like they take photos. And so like they take a photo. So like find something. It's like being a little, realize that your life could be like a treasure. It's very wonderful. And how do you find beauty in the midst of your life? Like we forget how important beauty is. And it can be just the shape of an iron fence,
Mhm.
something very ordinary. It does not have to be a flower or whatever that is. It can be. but to find some beauty, to pause. And the other is actually, how do you learn the names of the people that you depend on, like in the grocery store, or if you go to a bank, member of banks, and when people used to go there, but in a grocery store or in a little coffee place, how do you learn the people's names and figure out how do you learn a couple things about the people in your life that you depend on? Actually, one of our physicians, who's one of my students, he asked, like, how's my practice going? And I said, the key question is, like, tell me about the checkout people at the supermarket where you go. And he was so surprised.
Yeah.
It's like, what does that have to do with anything? I said, well, it has to do with who you depend on and what's your relationship with those people. And it turns out from the research, in particular, the longitudinal study from Harvard, that it completely matters. Our life becomes richer and more meaningful when we know those things, when we have those relationships, when you make just a little bit of effort, it goes a long way.
Your book is titled Untangled: Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion. What are some of the key messages that you want readers coming away with after reading your book?
I think the main thing that is most important for me is like what I learned when I was 11 years old when I went to study karate. And the teacher his name was Sensei White. And Sensei White used to have a sit in Seiza, which is like where you have your legs underneath yourself.
Yeah.
And he would walk around really steadily and say, you'll never be free until you can be still with your pain. And I remember thinking that that was like a superpower and an amazing thing. And I think that while we don't have to do something so extreme, like sit on our knees for 15 minutes, and yet we can really learn how to pause in the midst of our life when we feel entangled in something, learning how to pause and breathe through the difficulty. And for me, that's where the freedom actually lies. I've yet to experience awesome change when I didn't experience the struggle also. So I think that change requires very often the willingness to also struggle.
In terms of the response that you receive from the medical profession after reading your book or going to your center, completing a contemplative medicine fellowship, what do people say from the physicians that you talk to?
I was just teaching in Japan and with a group of about 300 clinicians there. And the message is pretty much the same cross-culturally too, is wow, I never thought about including myself in the care that I'm offering.
Mm,
And that even though that, doctors and nurse practitioners and different folks or maybe don't identify as a caregiver, but it's still part of the culture and it's
yeah.
part of norm and really turning that around and realizing that we don't have to, we can be a partner in this and that the depth of my care for you is only going to be equal to the amount of care I'm offering also to myself. So it's like giving and receiving equally. And so that message tends to be very powerful and helpful. And because we have these things in the medical profession, the clinical
Yeah.
professions, where like, oh, go home and do your self-care. Go home and work on your work-life balance. Well, we only have one life. We don't have a work life and a home life. We have one life. And self-care is more isolating in my experience, whether I'm teaching in England or in medical schools in the United States or in Japan, like the same stories. I'm so bad at my self-care. and I'm so lonely. Or now people are saying, like, I'm so bad at my self-compassion and I'm so lonely, So how do we realize we can actually remember that care and compassion don't need that self part on them,
Sure.
but just like, how do I learn how to be more caring and compassionate that includes me? So that way I'm with you, Kevin, is also the way I am with myself. If I'm resourced, I can offer you that feeling, as opposed to like if I'm feeling totally burnt out and under-resourced and undernourished, that's what I'm bringing to you. Who wants that?
Yeah.
Not I.
We're talking to Koshin Paley Ellison. He's a Zen teacher and psychotherapist. He's the author of the book Untangled, Walking the Eightfold Path to Clarity, Courage, and Compassion. Koshin will end with some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
So the main take home for me is, we only have the time that we have. That's actually what we have. And so how are you attending to the time you have? Are you actually doing what is nourishing? And what are you waiting for if you're not? And in our place, we recite a poem that for me is very exciting. And I just want to leave you with this short poem, which is, let me respectfully remind you that life and death are of supreme importance. Time swiftly passes by and opportunities are lost. On this day, the days of my life are decreased by one. Each of us must strive to awaken. Awaken. Take heed. Do not squander your life. Do what you need to do to not squander.
Koshin, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight. And thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you so much.